Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Hello there, folks. We're back for part 2 of, Travis and I talking about free speech, social media, and the way that all these things, are actually good things to help us to be able to communicate with each other and to communicate, injustices and make people aware of many things actually through social media, which is sort of good. But there's also a darker side to it. And so we were going ahead and tackling this. So, it's important for us to take it seriously because look, a lot of people thought habeas rights was untouchable. I'm sure. Okay. They probably felt like there's no way that could ever come into question or that could ever change or whatever, but it did. Through AEDPA, it did. We were all effectively stripped of those rights. Okay, so we have to always be vigilant. Free speech is one of the things that makes America truly great, the United States truly great, and we need to treat it as the precious thing that it is. So that's why Travis and I decided to get together and talk about this. So we'll go ahead and show you. Here comes part 2. I hope you guys find it interesting. And here we go. What I'm going to play right now, folks, is to ask you, obviously, is that with free speech, obviously there's always going to be people out there that get their feathers ruffled. Sometimes people say things that ruffle my feathers, even. Believe it or not. Anyway, so the thing is, we have to accept that that's going to happen. And the reason we need to accept that that's going to happen is because that's what allows us to continue to have discourse. It allows us to continue to talk about things. If we don't go off like an A-bomb every time somebody says something we don't like, right? If we don't go off like an A-bomb, it allows the conversation to continue. It allows for maybe some small point to be reached where there's maybe a consensus, or maybe a point like Travis was just talking about, that the greater good would be served by us not nitpicking each other to death. That's an excellent point, and it's valid. You know what I mean? So certain things like that, are to be taken into consideration. I'm going to play for you a clip right now of Jordan Peterson talking about the possibility of offending others in exercising your right to free speech.
Is being sensitive to offence such a problem, though? Like, we would have previously called that manners.
It's a terrible problem. So imagine you, okay, so the rule is you can't offend anyone, all right? Let's say you're speaking to one person, I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
But there are ways that you can share, I guess, provocative views where you attempt to still do that with an air of, say, respectfulness, where you're trying to mitigate against the offensiveness. This
is true, yeah. You can actually try listening when you're having a conversation, right? Assuming that both people who are having the conversation are of goodwill, and they're not trying to play tricks, and they're struggling towards the truth, which neither of them hold completely, and both understand that. Yeah, you can reach across fairly large gaps and negotiate peace. Thank God for that, or we'd be at each other's throats all the time.
Okay, so in that clip, you guys saw that Jordan was basically saying, like, the thing you have to accept with free speech or with any kind of, whenever you're talking about anything important or of substance and stuff, that when you talk and offer an opinion about it, that there's a chance you're going to offend somebody, and he lays it out to the interviewer by saying this. He's like, okay, he goes, let's say I'm talking to you, I can't offend you. Okay. He goes, now what if I'm talking to 10 people? Can I offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? At what point are we going to react and say somebody got offended and so somebody else has to shut up completely? Where do we draw the line? Where does that line get drawn? And does that line get drawn at all? Or do we all just need to suck it up and be big boys and girls and put on our big boy underwear and panties? You know what I mean? Seriously. I think that's really what needs to happen. We all just need to get a little thicker skin and be a little less emotional, I guess, maybe, possibly. I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for, but we do tend to react with our emotions sometimes on social media, so I felt it was an apt, description. But we all need to realize that it's just inherent with any kind of individual thought and reason and opinion that there's a good chance somebody out there's not going to like what you have to say. And that's just the way it's going to be. Thoughts, Trav?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on this. We're going to talk about what fighting words are. And so that speaker is a professor up in Canada, and he's very articulate. And I think he's frustrated. I think because we don't have that problem in the U.S. because we have the protection of a written constitution, specifically the First Amendment. They don't, and the pendulum has started to swing, apparently to the other side, and I can see his frustration. Now, it's over a very thorny issue that I really don't want to get into, because
we'll go into that later, folks.
Yeah,
what that issue is later.
Yeah, it could be religion, it could be race, things that here we would universally agree that, well, if I want to refer to somebody by a certain race by this name, no, I'm sorry, we can throw you out of school, we can throw you out of your professorship, and but there are other things that we're just working out as a society, globally. But so here in the U.S., here's what the standard is, and it's those fighting words I talked about. This is the line that the Supreme Court has drawn about, offensive. And so fighting words are words that, quote, by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace, unquote, or have a, quote, direct tendency to cause acts of violence by the person to whom individually that remark is addressed. That's quoting Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, a 1942 Supreme Court case. Subversive advocacy, that's one of the other areas of speech, is not protected. That's exhorting large numbers of people to engage in lawless conduct. Fighting words are directed at provoking a specific individual. Generally, only the most inflammatory and derisive epithets will be characterized as fighting words. Fighting words, now here's the key and the difference with Canada and what he's upset about. Fighting words should be distinguished from speech that is merely offensive. Crude or insensitive language may be heard in a variety of contexts, on television, at home, work. But the Supreme Court has ruled that speech that merely offends or hurts the feelings of another person without eliciting a more dramatic response is protected by the First Amendment. So let me say that again. The Supreme Court has ruled that speech that merely offends or hurts the feelings of another person without eliciting a more dramatic response is protected by the First Amendment. We don't have his problem
here,
or the perceived problem in Canada in the U.S. We don't have that problem. The court has also underscored the responsibility of receivers. This is going back to what you just said, Erekose. The court underscored the responsibility of receivers, that's listeners
hearing it.
or viewers, to ignore offensive speech. Receivers can move away or divert their eyes from an offensive speaker, program, image, message. In one case, the court ruled that a young man had the right to wear in a state courthouse a jacket with the slogan, and I'm quoting here, quote, "fuck the draft," emblazoned across the back, because persons at the courthouse could avert their eyes if offended. That's Cohen versus California, 1971. One man's vulgarity, the court said, is another's lyric. Let's say that again. One man's vulgarity, the court said, is another's lyric. And the words chosen in that case conveyed a stronger message that would be sublimated or, part of the resist the draft. But you're not going to see this in the U.S. except what you said before, EDPA, the Patriot Act.
Always fear a new piece of legislation, folks, that can rob us of our rights again. Always be mindful.
Yeah. In time of war, we pass the silliest, craziest things, and then they stick around forever. And we need to be hyper vigilant on those when those things come about. But here's a contrast with our country was based on UK common law, and then we adopted it, but we are a little different. And how we are different is our freedom of speech, and we protect the press, and so it's more difficult to recover against a newspaper or publisher or television network or movie producer than it is in the UK. Right. And the other major difference we have is the Second Amendment. And, I know, Erekose, you have viewers that are on opposite spectrums of the Second Amendment.
Yep.
And so one person saying something, it is offensive to the other side, but being offensive doesn't get you there. But, I wanted to talk a little bit about, the situation he's talking about isn't really an issue in the U.S.
But my problem is that could legislation be coming down the pike someday, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that could possibly put us in a similar boat? I'm just saying
No.
there's a wind blowing right now, and it's a strong wind, and I'm just wondering exactly how strong that wind's going to come through and what exactly it's going to do.
In the U.S., how I'll just say it with regard to gay rights. So it came out principally out of California, and why there are protections and safeguards in place. Why California has in all of their laws that you cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation. That's not in the federal protections. So the Federal Fair Housing Act says you cannot discriminate based on race, religion, national origin, or gender. Right. And then in employment context, if you have more than 15 employees, and on some statutes 50 and another, you can't age discriminate over 40, and you can't discriminate because somebody is pregnant. So that's the federal. But in California and in some individual cities, they've added sexual orientation and more recently gender identity. So sexual orientation became protected because a particular group, they saw how African Americans were able to get the protections that they had been promised under the 14th Amendment, but had been denied up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They took a page out of the history book and saw how they did it. And how did they do it? They did it by, nonviolent, peaceful protests.
Be classy.
Yeah, but they were in your face, and they blocked traffic. They sat in at various places. They sat at the counter. They sat in the front of the bus,
Right.
and in a non-violent way. And the other thing they did is economic boycott. And so that particular group in California, they would go and they would target companies. And that community got organized, and they got organized to the point where, and this was way before social media, and I was living in the Bay Area at the time, that did it with meetings and community activism, how you did it at the time, grassroots, but they were able to focus on, it was in high school at the time, but I remember getting, they were also piggybacking off of Cesar Chavez and what he did for migrant farm workers, boycott grapes, boycott lettuce. And they targeted certain companies, and they brought some national companies to their knees. That's how you do it. So they, it's, I can't imagine where we'd have some sort of law that it's a crime to call somebody X.
Right.
Just don't see that. It's going to be
What if there was the opposite? What if there was a compelled speech to call X something in particular? Like, what if that would be the opposite? What do you think about that?
Well, where we see it, we've seen it in some laws, and the most recent case was a case on a baker in Oregon, wasn't it? That they were going to compel them to make a cake.
Oh, yes,
so
that's right.
And for a same-sex marriage.
Right.
And is that a violation of freedom of speech, or
freedom of religion?
Is it?
Right.
But yeah, the exercise of. But to me, it really wasn't. They were in that town that passed that statute, and to me, it really wasn't an infringement at all. For example, name me a hotel that says we are not going to, the only way we'll rent to two people, only way we'll let you stay overnight at our hotel if you're two people of the same sex is, if you have separate beds.
Right.
We're, as a society, we're telling Hilton and Ramada and Travelodge and all the others, but public accommodations are, they fall under that that gambit.
Oh, okay.
And so if
Fair Housing Act is what you called it, right?
Well, it's so how this came under the Civil Rights Act. It applies to restaurants even. It's, some restaurant owners were saying, well, no, I don't have to allow this person or that person. No, if you're a restaurant that serves travelers, then you're part of interstate commerce and you cannot discriminate based on, so you can tell a restaurant owner if they're going to accept persons of a particular race who are interstate travelers, and they're going to feed them, and they're getting the benefit of being right off the interstate, et cetera, et cetera. No, you can be told who you have to serve, or we will shut you down. And it's because it's part of a public conveyance. So airline travel, train travel, buses, you cannot discriminate. But but that's an interesting question. You shall, and let's just make it not controversial. So, there was a time when we called our teachers, when I was in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, it was Miss Stoner or Mrs. Arbogast, or, it was Miss and Mrs. And heck, my mom, I remember in addressing envelopes, return address would say, Mrs., and it would be my dad's full name, but, so, but over time, we all generally refer, to women by Ms., and, but there's no law, it's just society evolved. I hear every once in a while, usually the way I see it is, someone says, well, Mrs. So-and-so, and they'll say it's Ms., but they're usually somebody of authority, like a senator or a congresswoman. And so, I apologize, Ms., but I don't want to get too touchy or sensitive, but there are times we use terms African American, and then black, the black community, that was out of favor for a while. African Americans was preferred, and then now it's kind of both. But there are individuals, and I have to be extremely careful in court how when I ask a witness, what color were they, and were they white, African American, Asian? You do have to be careful of that, because you don't want to offend the jury or whatnot. But things change, and some people complain about that. Well, I wish they'd make up their mind, and it's like, it's not they that make up their mind. It's this stuff, it evolves culturally and academically and so on and so forth. But I think the Supreme Court could come up with a
new interpretation,
a decision that in essence says, yeah, you need to call somebody by this thing, or you're guilty of
hate speech.
Well, no, it'd be violation of the Fair Housing Act, or the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act,
Right.
and so that would, in essence, make that a violation. That if you don't call people by this name or that name, you're in violation. But I, and I know that's what the legislation was in Canada, but um, you know, part of this too is I need to know more about that legislation in Canada. But for right now, purposes of our discussion, it
I could say
doesn't
it, but I
really
don't
matter.
want to talk about it.
It
So
doesn't matter the issue. It could be, um, progressive thing. But let's say, it's a statute that says you shall refer to any woman, in addressing her as Ms. Uh, if you call her Miss or Mrs., it's $100 fine.
right.
Um, you know, uh, just don't ever see that I don't even see legislation being
And I'm absolutely
proposed.
hopeful that you are absolutely 100% right. And I'm hoping that it isn't a problem in the U.S. But around the world, there is something afoot, in the world right now. So it'll be interesting to see it all play out. There's some interesting little dramas happening around, but not to get too much into that. So I have one more clip left. So I want to wrap it up with that clip, and I know you have one more thing you wanted to talk about, an article, right?
Yeah, so this article, funny enough, is about somebody, those of you viewers who follow Erekose's channel will know, specifically me. There's an article about a case I had over 15 years ago. Y'all may have remembered there was social media was just starting, and Congress was looking at some reforms on immigration. It was 15 years ago, and there were people on both sides of that issue back then, and so some high school kids decided they were going to march from their high school to their neighborhood high school in protesting what Congress was looking at doing on immigration reform. And these protests were nationwide. I think there was 2 or 3 areas in the U.S. where they arrested kids. And one of them, of course, was Round Rock, Texas. They arrested 200 kids, 250 kids maybe. And it was big news here. It actually made national news. But I got a call from the Texas Civil Rights Project, and they said, we would like you to represent one of these kids, and we'd like you to try the first case to go to trial because we think it'll have a significant effect. But the First Amendment has been a very near and dear issue to me, going all the way back even before law school. And so when I was asked to represent this young man, Irvin DeLuna, who had been illegally arrested in a gym with hundreds of his other classmates and faced with this criminal charge, I said, of course I'll represent him. And in Texas, we get a jury trial regardless of the level of the offense. And so I demanded a jury, and we went to trial, and fortunately we prevailed. The only way that they could win, they tried to do a curfew violation, but that's protected by the First Amendment, if it's a legitimate First Amendment thing, which it was. They were clearly marching in protest of the
Immigration law.
Congress.
Right.
Yeah. And so then they went with the school disruption statute, which was passed in the Vietnam War era because of demonstrations at different universities. And if your demonstration was loud enough where you sat in the administration building and you disrupted the school or education in some way, then you could prosecute for that. But as long as you weren't disruptive, students have the right to protest, and so that, even though that was a minuscule case in terms of what the penalty could be, that was one of my proudest moments as a lawyer, was be able to defend that man.
And he was one of the initial cases, right?
He was the first case.
And did that discourage
He was the first.
the county or the state from, somewhat at least, from, persecuting these kids?
Yes, through the hard work of another law firm that filed a case in federal court, a civil rights case, but based on this victory, all of the negative publicity that came out for the school after this, and it's so funny. I kept trying to find out, well, who made the decision to write these 200 kids these citations, which is in effect an arrest,
Right.
and a promise to appear back in court. And was it the administrator? Was it the principal? Because they have school resource officers, which are law enforcement officers in school.
Yeah.
Was it you? And the thing was that they would never admit whose call it was, and of course they don't. I'm very used to the fact you give quotes and you never get what you're trying to convey. They take what snippets they think are important. It never really fits the context, but pointed out that the citizens in that school district should have deep concerns that they can't even identify who was responsible for
pulling the trigger on writing all these citations,
arresting all of these, because
Right.
we knew, they marched back from this other high school. They marched back to their school. They did it cooperatively. They walked on the sidewalk. I mean, they were the most well-behaved 250 high school kids I'd ever seen. And that's what we argued to the jury, and we had the video of all of it. And then they guided them all back in the gym, and then they locked the doors, and then proceeded to write every kid in there, a citation for either curfew or school disruption or both. Curfew truancy. And I said, well, who made that decision? I said, so you just decided on your own to march over? Well, and him and Han and the jury was like, that just didn't add up. But the main thing was, I fortunately had this teacher at the other school that I said, could you hear the protest in your classroom? No.
So no disruption.
I said, well, but everybody ran to the windows for a second to look. Yeah. And then when you asked them to take their seats, did they? Yeah. Did you resume class? Yeah. it's like, okay, like, most things, it was there was no disruption.
Yeah.
If that was the intent, it was, a total failure. And they, they weren't going to let those kids come into the campus and
Right.
yell and whatnot. So they just were all there on the sidewalk,
Right.
yelling and screaming whatever they were yelling. But no, and so this goes to your point,
Yes.
Richard. So, and it's prosecutorial discretion, and about these cases. Are we going to appeal this? Are we going to request an en banc hearing? Are we going to, do this or that? But so cops are allowed to write citations. They need probable cause, and then from there, we filed motions to dismiss the curfew truancy violation based on First Amendment grounds. And then, that's a judge. And then those got dismissed. And then we were left with this school disruption thing. And but the city attorney, they decided, okay, well, we're gonna go forward with this. And just how stupid. And then that's when they brought me in, and they tried talking, this makes no sense, just dismiss all of these. And no, it's like, okay, we want a jury trial. And I got the call, and fortunately, we have the jury system. That's the great protector.
Yeah.
But I was in a very, very conservative county, and but it was the questions I asked, and I wasn't getting the responses. And then one of the potential jurors was what is your occupation? I'm a Lutheran minister. That's a trial lawyer's dream in a First Amendment case. I said, no kidding. I said,
right, Lutheran based on Martin Luther? Okay, gotcha.
Martin Luther's protest about? And he said, well, you're talking about the 99 Theses? I said, well, I knew it was called something, but what was his act of protest? He said, well, he nailed them to the door. I said, and then that launched the Protestant Reformation, and that's, exactly. I said, so some consider him to be the greatest protester of all time. Yes, they do. And then, so
he sat in Germany and minced words with pretty much all the great kings and leaders of Europe. So
yeah, and and then if you get into it historically, that wasn't his intent to cause a divide.
He just had questions, right?
He was sick of people being able to pay cash for dispensations on their sins.
Right.
It's like, well, I don't want to have to do all of that. Well, write a check. Okay. And he was just totally against that, and he called him out on it. And like most things, the folks at the Home Office, which is in Rome, they didn't take kindly to that. And so it just started, like a lot of things, the ball rolling. And then, we ended up, there were some other things along with that too, like King Henry wasn't too happy with his wife because he didn't have a male heir. And, it wasn't catching on to him that the male is the one that determines the sex of the child, that it really wasn't his wives had the problem. It was really him who had the problem.
Medical science wasn't exactly advanced back then, so yes.
Right. And, so he was wanting a dispensation about marrying his
Catherine
brother's
Aragon
wife, and yada yada, and that didn't go his way. So
he declared himself the leader of the church, or the head of the Church of England, and gave it to himself.
yeah, after he burned St. Thomas More, mistake. Yeah, exactly. But anyway, it caused the Reformation, and then they just weren't responding to my questions. They weren't giving me honest answers. Do you think I said I said, do you think a high school student who doesn't believe in abortion should be able to protest? And then that finally got him. I was finally able to find some wolves in sheep's clothing. And then, how about if your son or daughter is in the band and they say they're going to cut funds for the band because they need money for football? Should your son or daughter be able to go out and protest in front of the school board
Right.
that
Frame it and make it personal, right? That's the idea
yeah,
there.
and then I carried that all the way to closing argument. Say, yeah, you may be totally against what they protested about,
Right.
but that's this time. The next time, they may say, we're cutting the football program, and your son has been on the team for 3 years and given his dedication and effort and time into
Practice
doing
every
that.
day,
Yeah,
Right.
or your son or daughter is in the band, and they say, no, we're going to cut this out. And the only thing they did is march. They didn't disrupt school. They haven't proven their case. And if you convict him merely because you don't agree with what he marched about, we're all lost.
Right. Yes, I agree. The fact is, he has the right to do it. That's, yeah, I agree. I do agree. That's great. I mean, actually, that's great that you were involved in that, buddy. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was glad I was asked, but it is an important issue, and it goes by your point. I don't think we'll see anything on a national level,
Maybe not.
but on a local level, you could get
Certain things.
and you see it a lot at local level. They're going to ban this book from the library, and if somebody doesn't get up and say, hold on,
Right.
yeah, Lady Chatterley's Lovers, a little bit, but where does it end? If you can ban this book, what's the next book? And what's the next book? And so, yeah,
Right.
it's important.
Right on. Yeah, so that's a lot of interesting stuff that we've talked about today, obviously. So I'm going to leave everybody here with some final thoughts here and one final clip. This is a clip, again, of Jordan Peterson. And the thing I want people to look at in this clip is watch it, how pointed the questions are coming at Jordan. How judge for yourself whether you feel that those questions are being offered in a polite way or if they are being kind of machine gunned at him, or just kind of fired at him. But watch the way that he reacts to them. Watch the things that he says and the thing that he ultimately ends up pointing out to this interviewer. Because when he points it out, she misses it, and so he has to reiterate the point he was making that she missed. And it's really funny when you see this reporter who actually then has to take about 3 to 5 seconds on camera to collect herself and actually register what Jordan Peterson has just said to her. Very interesting clip. Remember, folks, it's always a two-way street. We're not always going to agree with each other. Sometimes we'll get people that agree with us. Yes, of course. But sometimes we won't. And we all need to learn to just have a little thicker skin, because we don't want to start, we don't want to start deciding some people shouldn't be part of the conversation and therefore start censoring people or trying to do that. That shouldn't be our goal. Our goal should be to take in all of the points of view and decide on which one has the most merit and which one's the best one to go with. So I leave you with this clip, folks. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, of course. And we'll leave you with Jordan Peterson and Kathy
Does it
Newman.
bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's no more divisive than the fact that YouTube is primarily male and Tumblr is
Well, that's
primarily
pretty divisive,
female.
isn't
Well,
it?
but Tumblr is primarily female.
Right, you're just saying that's the way it is.
Well, I'm not saying anything. It's just an observation that that's the way it is. There's plenty of women that are watching my lectures and coming to my talks and buying my books. It's just that the majority of them happen to be men.
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No,
I want to
that's
ask-
not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
Not
to
once it was
outlaw
law.
discrimination.
No.
Why
Well,
should
that's what
your-
they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm
you
very
get my
glad that
point.
I've
No, but you get
exercised
my
my freedom of
point.
speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
And
do
that is
you-
what you should do. But
and
you're
you-
exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Ha, gotcha.
you have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work
about
that through in
time.
my head. Yeah. It took a while.
It did, yeah.
Took a while. You have voluntarily come into the studio and agreed to be questioned.
Mhm.
A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called.
And that's never
she.
happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning.
All right, so as you all know, I very much love talking with Travis. It was great getting to sit down and talk about this and do this video with him. Him having the actual legal expertise and knowing about it. Obviously, having argued a First Amendment case successfully, so that's pretty awesome. So it's really important for us to have our rights to free speech. It allows us to be able to talk about what's going on. If these rights were ever to start being curtailed, it would most likely be because there's something under the table going on that's trying to be hidden. And so we have to always be vigilant of it, because our Constitution giving us the right to free speech and all the many things that it gives us is marvelous. It's spectacular. But if we don't pay attention and keep it from being spoiled, for selfish reasons in a lot of ways, sometimes, possibly, for whatever reasons, but you never want, the whole point of this is you never want government basically controlling speech. It's always a bad idea. It's a slippery slope, because once they change speech in one way, what's to stop them from changing it again in another? Right? I mean, so they're successful on this one front, and maybe it was something fairly benign and not that big of a deal, so it wasn't, whatever. But maybe the second or the third thing that they try to compel, or whatever, it's just as soon as the government starts getting involved in what speech can and can't be said, it's a slippery slope. And so we need to be constantly vigilant that doesn't happen here, because it's like I said earlier, I'm sure everybody thought that our habeas rights were untouchable at one point in time. Okay? I'm pretty certain of that. Because as Travis has told us in the past, the only other time that the habeas writ has been suspended in this country's history was by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. That was the last time prior to 1996, whatever, when all this went down and AEDPA was passed. But prior to that, it was only Abraham Lincoln had suspended it for a couple years, whatever the amount, just during the Civil War, but then it was reinstated. So I'm sure a lot of people thought that our habeas rights were untouchable, but I think we found that that wasn't actually true. Finally, that last clip I think is very, very brilliant, folks, because it sums up exactly what everybody's trying to do. Everybody is trying to say and represent the whatever cause that they feel is worthy, and so that is what that interviewer in that clip, her name is Kathy Newman, that's what she's doing. She's pursuing, what she sees as truth and justice for the people that she, cares about, right? It's, for whatever reason she cares, and she wants to grill Jordan on this, right? So that's great, and Jordan tells her that, right? And that's what's brilliant about this, because Jordan's pointing out, look, you're asking me why should I have a right to offend, when you're sitting here during this entire interview coming at me in a way that I find offensive for an entire interview, right? And he's just pointing it out to her, and he's quick to tell her, but that's what you're supposed to do. That's your job here is to do that. So, more power to you. But he's just pointing out to her so that she can see it, that it's not really possible to talk about important things without potentially offending somebody, right? That's what it always comes down to in the end. We all have to just try to be a little bit of a thicker skin on us, and just keep in mind that the human condition is an ongoing endeavor, and we have to all be mindful and try to do our best to continue to move forward. And but we need to also be respectful of each other. We need to be respectful of the fact that we're all human. We all understand the human condition. If you take a little time to think about it, I'm sure it will begin to become clear to most of us that we want to be reasonable, right? And we want reason to be something that matters. Logic, facts, truth. That's what should matter. So that sums up this video, part 2 of my chat with Travis Williamson about free speech. It's, as I said before, it's been an absolute pleasure to do another video with Travis. I love getting together with Travis to do little videos. So that's it for today. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.